Before we dive into one of the greatest naval battles in human history, let me ask you something. What happens when the largest naval force ever assembled in the ancient world sails into a narrow strait where their numbers mean nothing? What happens when 300 Greek warships face down 600 Persian vessels and somehow win? Logic says the Greeks lose. Mathematics says they die. But on September 23rd, 480 BC, in the narrow waters between Salamis Island and the Greek mainland, Themistocles, an Athenian general with no royal blood and no formal naval training, orchestrated a trap so brilliant that it destroyed Persian naval power in a single afternoon and saved Western civilization from conquest. This isn't a story about brave men making heroic stands. This is a story about deception, geography as a weapon, and one man who understood that in naval warfare, numbers mean nothing if you can't use them. No romanticism, no divine intervention, just strategy, calculated risk, and the cold mathematics of how to sink 600 ships. If this sounds like history worth your time, hit that like button and drop a comment. Now let's go back 2,500 years and watch Themistocles destroy an empire. To understand how we got to Salamis, you need to understand what was at stake. In 480 BC, Xerxes, king of kings of the Persian Empire, invaded Greece with the largest military force the ancient world had ever seen. Modern historians estimate his army at somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 men. His navy numbered 600 warships, mostly triremes, the advanced warships of the ancient Mediterranean. These weren't ceremonial vessels, they were weapons. Each trireme carried around 200 men, including rowers, marines, and archers. They were designed for one purpose: to ram enemy ships at high speed, punch a hole below the waterline, and sink them. Xerxes wasn't coming to negotiate. He was coming to conquer, to punish the Greeks for supporting rebellions in his empire, and to extend Persian control over all of Europe. The Greeks were hopelessly divided. City-states that spent most of their time fighting each other now faced an existential threat. Some Greek cities immediately surrendered, offering earth and water to Xerxes as symbols of submission. Others, primarily Athens and Sparta, chose to resist, but resistance seemed futile. The Persians had already crushed the northern Greek defenses. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans and several thousand other Greeks held a narrow mountain pass for 3 days before being outflanked and annihilated. That battle bought time, nothing more. The Persian army continued south. Athens lay directly in their path, and Athens had a problem: they couldn't defend their city. The walls weren't strong enough, the army wasn't large enough, so the Athenians made an impossible decision. They evacuated every man, woman, and child. They abandoned Athens, loaded everyone onto ships, and fled to the nearby island of Salamis. Imagine that. Your entire city, your temples, your homes, everything you've ever known, abandoned to an invading army because you have no other choice. The Persian army arrived in Athens and found it empty. They burned it anyway. Every temple, every building, everything reduced to ash and smoke. From Salamis, the Athenian refugees could see their city burning, smoke rising into the sky, everything gone. But here's the thing: the Athenians had already accepted that loss, because Themistocles had convinced them that Athens wasn't the buildings or the temples. Athens was its people. And as long as the people survived, Athens survived. This wasn't poetry, this was cold pragmatism. Themistocles understood that naval power would decide this war, not armies, not land battles, ships. Control the sea, control everything. Now let's talk about Themistocles. He wasn't a king. He wasn't from one of Athens' noble families. He was a commoner who had risen through Athens' democratic political system through intelligence and ruthlessness. A few years earlier, Athens had discovered a massive silver vein in the mines at Laurium. Suddenly, the city was rich. The question became what to do with that wealth. Most Athenians wanted to distribute it as payments to citizens. Themistocles argued they should build ships, a massive fleet, 200 triremes. He convinced them by pointing to Athens' regional rival, Aegina, and arguing they needed naval superiority. But Themistocles was already thinking about Persia. He knew the Persians would come. He knew the war would be decided at sea. So he manipulated Athenian politics to build the fleet he knew he'd need. By 480 BC, Athens had the largest navy in Greece. Without those ships, the Athenians couldn't have evacuated. Without those ships, there's no Battle of Salamis. One man's foresight changed everything, but having ships and knowing how to use them are different things. After Thermopylae fell and Athens burned, the Greek allied fleet gathered at Salamis. About 380 warships total. Athens contributed around 200. Sparta, Corinth, Aegina, and other city-states provided the rest. They were outnumbered almost 2-1 by the Persian fleet. Worse, many of the Greek commanders wanted to abandon Salamis and retreat to the Isthmus of Corinth, a narrow land bridge connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece. The Spartans and Corinthians argued this was the logical defensive position. Build a wall across the isthmus, concentrate all forces there, defend Sparta and the southern cities. Abandon everything north of that line, including Athens and Salamis. For the Athenians, this was unacceptable. If the fleet retreated south, the Persian army would occupy all of central Greece, and the Athenian refugees on Salamis would be stranded, starving, and eventually slaughtered. Themistocles' new retreat was suicide, not just for Athens, but for all of Greece. The Persians would consolidate control, resupply, and eventually overwhelm any defensive position. The Greeks had to fight, but where? The answer was obvious, right here, in the strait between Salamis and the mainland. The strait was narrow, at its tightest point less than a mile wide. If the Greek fleet could lure the Persians into that confined space, Persian numerical superiority would become a liability. 600 ships trying to maneuver in a narrow channel would collide with each other, lose formation, create chaos. Meanwhile, the Greek fleet, smaller and more maneuverable, could use the terrain to their advantage, hit the Persians from multiple angles, ram them in the flanks, sink them in clusters, turn the battle into a series of small engagements where numbers didn't matter. It was brilliant. It was risky. And it required the Persians to cooperate by sailing into the trap. The problem was convincing the other Greek commanders. The Spartans didn't trust Themistocles. He was a commoner, an Athenian democrat, and far too clever for their taste. The Corinthians openly accused him of trying to save Athens at the expense of the rest of Greece. Multiple war councils devolved into shouting matches. Themistocles argued, threatened, and manipulated, but the allied commanders kept voting to retreat. Time was running out. The Persian fleet was anchored nearby at Phaleron Bay, just a few miles from Salamis. They could attack at any moment. If the Greek fleet scattered before that attack came, the war was over. Themistocles needed to force a battle before the allies could retreat, so he did something extraordinary. He betrayed them, or at least, he made the Persians think he did. Themistocles sent a trusted slave named Sisinus to the Persian camp with a message for Xerxes. The message claimed that Themistocles secretly supported the Persian cause and wanted to warn them that the Greek fleet was planning to escape during the night. If the Persians moved quickly, they could trap the Greeks in the strait and destroy them before they scattered. It was a complete fabrication. But Xerxes believed it. Why wouldn't he? It fit perfectly with his understanding of Greek politics. The Greeks were divided, constantly bickering, ready to betray each other for advantage. A Greek general offering information in exchange for future favor made perfect sense. Xerxes ordered his fleet to move. That night, Persian ships sailed into position, blocking the exits from the Salamis Strait. Some circled around to the western side of the island, cutting off that escape route. Others positioned themselves at the eastern entrance, ready to sail in at dawn. By morning, the Greeks were trapped. Exactly as Themistocles wanted. When the Greek commanders woke up and discovered they were surrounded, panic erupted. Accusations flew. Some blamed Themistocles, though they didn't yet know he'd orchestrated it. Others demanded they beach their ships and flee inland. But Themistocles stood before the assembled commanders and explained the situation with brutal clarity. They were trapped. They couldn't retreat even if they wanted to. The only option was to fight, and if they were going to fight, this narrow strait was the best possible battlefield. The Persians had done exactly what he needed them to do. They'd committed their entire fleet to an enclosed space where their numbers meant nothing. Now the Greeks just had to kill them. It wasn't inspiring rhetoric. It was stating facts. Fight here, maybe win. Run, definitely die. The commanders voted to fight. On the morning of September 23, 480 BC, both fleets prepared for battle. The Persian fleet organized into 3 divisions. The Phoenician contingent, the most skilled sailors in the Persian navy, took the right wing. The Ionian Greeks, who served Persia because their cities were under Persian control, took the left. Egyptian ships held the center. Altogether, around 600 warships formed up at the eastern entrance of the strait, preparing to sail in and crush the Greek fleet. From the shore, Xerxes himself watched. He'd had a throne set up on a hillside overlooking the strait so he could personally observe the annihilation of Greek naval power. Scribes sat beside him, ready to record the names of commanders who performed well and those who showed cowardice. Everything was prepared for victory. The Greeks were trapped. The numbers favored Persia overwhelmingly. There was no way they could lose. The Greek fleet, about 380 ships, formed up inside the strait. The Athenians, with about 200 triremes, held the left wing. The Spartans, despite their small naval contribution, held the honorary right wing. Corinthians, Aeginetans, and other allied contingents filled the center. They waited. This is important. They didn't rush forward. They held position, backs near the Salamis shore, letting the Persians come to them. Because Themistocles understood something fundamental about naval warfare in narrow spaces, the fleet that moves first loses formation first. The fleet that moves second can respond, adapt, exploit gaps. So the Greeks waited. The Persian fleet began to advance, 600 warships rowing forward into the strait. Imagine that sight. The water churned white from thousands of oars. The sound of drums keeping rowing cadence echoed off the mountains. From the shore, it must have looked unstoppable. A wall of ships, advancing to crush a smaller, weaker force. But as the Persians entered the strait, problems emerged immediately. The formation compressed. Ships that had been properly spaced in open water now found themselves too close together. The outer wings couldn't extend as far as planned because the geography limited their maneuver space. The center became crowded. Ships started interfering with each other's oar strokes. Rowers on one ship clashed oars with rowers on adjacent ships. Speed decreased. Formation coherence degraded. And the Greeks hadn't even engaged yet. Then the Greeks attacked. Not a disorganized rush, but a coordinated advance. Each Greek trireme aimed for a specific target, rowing at maximum speed to build ramming velocity. This is how ancient naval combat worked. A trireme had a bronze ram at its prow, just below the waterline. If you hit an enemy ship at the right angle with enough speed, that ram punched through the hull planking, creating a hole that flooded the ship. The enemy vessel would sink in minutes, but ramming required precision. Hit at the wrong angle, and you damage your own ship or get stuck. Hit too slowly, and the ram wouldn't penetrate. So Greek trireme crews trained constantly on rowing speed, timing, and coordination. At Salamis, that training mattered. The Athenian left wing hit the Persian right. The Phoenician ships, despite being excellent sailors, found themselves unable to maneuver, too many ships in too little space. The Athenians rammed them in the flanks where the hulls were weakest. Persian ships began sinking, not one or two, dozens. The Phoenician line started to buckle. They tried to backrow to create space, but that just pushed them into ships behind them. Chaos spread through the Persian right wing. Xerxes, watching from his throne, saw his best ships being destroyed by what should have been an inferior enemy. He couldn't understand what was happening. On paper, this was impossible. In the center, the crowding became catastrophic. Persian ships literally couldn't row effectively because they kept colliding with friendly vessels. Greek triremes penetrated the formation, ramming from multiple angles. When a Persian ship sank, it didn't just remove that ship from the battle. It created an obstacle. A sinking trireme, full of drowning men, became a navigational hazard for every nearby ship. Other vessels tried to avoid it, which broke their formation further, which created more opportunities for Greek rams. The Persians had brought 600 ships, expecting overwhelming numerical superiority. Instead, they'd created a floating traffic jam where numbers meant nothing. On the Persian left, the Ionian Greek contingent fought differently. These were Greeks serving Persia, fighting against other Greeks. Some fought effectively, others barely tried. There are accounts of Ionian ships deliberately rowing slowly, avoiding serious combat, hoping not to harm their fellow Greeks, while also not openly mutinying against Persia. Whether that's true or propaganda is unclear. What's certain is that the Persian left wing failed to break through the Greek right. The Spartans and Aeginetans held their positions, and the Ionians couldn't or wouldn't push the attack decisively. The battle lasted for hours. Ancient naval combat wasn't quick. Ships rammed, disengaged, repositioned, rammed again. Marines on the decks shot arrows and threw javelins at enemy crews. When ships collided and stuck together, hand-to-hand fighting erupted. Men fought on tilting decks, surrounded by drowning comrades, knowing that if their ship sank, they'd likely drown too. Most ancient sailors couldn't swim. The weight of armor guaranteed drowning if you went into the water. So they fought with absolute desperation. Lose your ship, lose your life. The Persians fought bravely. This wasn't a story of cowardice, but bravery doesn't overcome bad positioning and catastrophic overcrowding. By mid-afternoon, the Persian fleet was disintegrating. Ships on the flanks tried to retreat back toward open water, but that movement created more congestion. Ships trying to advance collided with ships trying to retreat. The Greeks pressed the attack, systematically ramming and sinking every Persian vessel they could reach. The water filled with wreckage, corpses, drowning men screaming for help that wouldn't come. The Persians had lost formation, lost cohesion, lost command structure. It had become a slaughter. Individual Persian ships fought skillfully and sank Greek triremes, but overall, the battle was decided. The Persian fleet was dying in the strait, exactly as Themistocles had planned. Xerxes watched from his throne as his navy disintegrated. The sources claim he tore his robes in frustration and rage. He'd brought the largest fleet ever assembled. He'd trapped the Greeks exactly where he wanted them. And somehow, impossibly, he was losing. By evening, the surviving Persian ships retreated back to Phaleron Bay. Greek ships pursued, capturing or sinking stragglers. When the battle ended, the Persians had lost somewhere between 200 and 300 ships. The Greeks lost about 40. It wasn't even close. One afternoon, one battle, the entire strategic situation reversed. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The water around Salamis was choked with wreckage. Thousands of Persian sailors and marines were dead, drowned in the narrow strait. Survivors clung to debris, hoping for rescue. Some made it to shore and were captured by Greek forces. Others drowned from exhaustion. The Greeks spent the night securing prisoners and salvaging equipment from wrecked ships. They expected the Persians to attack again the next morning. They didn't. Xerxes had seen enough. His fleet was crippled. He couldn't control the sea, and without controlling the sea, he couldn't supply his massive army in Greece. The logistics were impossible. Every piece of food, every weapon, every piece of equipment had to be transporting overland from Asia. With the Greek fleet intact and capable of raiding his supply lines, continuing the campaign was suicide. So Xerxes made a decision. He would leave, not immediately. That would look like panic, but soon. He left a substantial army in Greece under his general Mardonius, with orders to continue the conquest the following spring. Then Xerxes took the bulk of his forces and marched back toward Asia. The invasion was over, not because his army had been defeated. Because his navy had been destroyed, and without naval supremacy, the campaign couldn't continue. One battle changed everything. Let's talk about what made this victory possible, because it wasn't luck or divine intervention. It was geography weaponized through strategy. Themistocles chose the battlefield. He forced the engagement by deceiving Xerxes into surrounding the Greek fleet. He understood that in a narrow strait, the Persian numerical advantage would become a disadvantage. 600 ships needed space to maneuver. In the Salamis Strait, they didn't have it. The geography did half the work before the Greeks even attacked. That's the lesson. Terrain matters in naval warfare just as much as land warfare. Control where the battle happens, and you control the outcome. The Persians could have refused to enter the strait. They could have blockaded from a distance, starved the Greeks out, forced them to come out into open water. But Xerxes was impatient, and Themistocles' deception was convincing. So they sailed in, and they died. Now let's talk about Themistocles' deception. Sending Sisinus to Xerxes with false information was extraordinarily risky. If Xerxes had suspected the trick, if he'd tortured Sisinus for information, if the plan had been exposed, the Greeks would have lost their best commander's credibility and possibly the battle itself. But Themistocles understood psychology. He understood that Xerxes expected Greek disunity and betrayal. He told Xerxes what Xerxes already believed. That's how effective deception works. You don't invent an incredible lie. You tell a plausible lie that confirms the enemy's existing assumptions. Xerxes thought the Greeks were weak, divided, and ready to collapse. Themistocles gave him information that fit that worldview, and Xerxes acted on it, committing his fleet to the trap. The role of the Athenian evacuation also deserves examination. Abandoning Athens was psychologically devastating, but strategically essential. If the Athenians had tried to defend their city, they'd have been besieged and slaughtered. Instead, they preserved their population and their fleet. That evacuation was only possible because Themistocles had built those 200 triremes years earlier. Every decision connected. Build ships. Evacuate the city. Lure the enemy into a trap. Fight where geography negates their advantage. Each step was necessary. Remove any one element, and the plan collapses. That level of strategic coherence across multiple decisions separated Themistocles from ordinary commanders. He didn't react to events, he shaped them. The human cost of Salamis was staggering. Thousands of Persian sailors died, most by drowning. Ancient naval combat was particularly brutal because survival rates after your ship sank were nearly zero. No life jackets, no rescue helicopters, no nearby vessels willing to stop mid-battle to fish you out of the water. If your ship went down, you drowned. If you were lucky, you drowned quickly. If unlucky, you clung to wreckage for hours before exhaustion took you. The Greeks also suffered casualties, though far fewer. 40 ships lost still meant thousands of Greek sailors dead. Every family on Salamis and Athens knew someone who didn't come back from that battle. Victory has a price. The Athenians paid it. Xerxes' retreat changed the trajectory of European history. If Salamis had gone differently, if the Persians had destroyed the Greek fleet and maintained naval control, they could have continued supplying their army indefinitely. Eventually, Greek resistance would have collapsed. Athens would have been erased. Sparta would have submitted or died. Greek culture, democracy, philosophy, drama, all of it would have been suppressed under Persian rule. Western civilization, as we understand it, wouldn't exist. That sounds dramatic, but it's accurate. Greek cultural and intellectual achievements required Greek independence. Salamis ensured that independence. One battle, one afternoon, everything changed. The following year, the Persian army that Xerxes left in Greece under Mardonius tried again. At Plataea in 479 BC, a unified Greek army destroyed them in a land battle. That victory was possible because Greek morale remained high after Salamis and because the Persians couldn't resupply or reinforce effectively without naval control. Salamis didn't end the Persian wars by itself, but it made ending them possible. Naval power determined strategic possibilities. Themistocles understood that. Xerxes didn't, or at least didn't act on it. Let's examine the Persian command decisions more closely. Xerxes made two critical errors. First, he believed Themistocles' false information without sufficient verification. A more cautious commander would have questioned why an enemy general was offering such valuable intelligence. Xerxes's overconfidence and his assumptions about Greek weakness led him to accept the deception at face value. Second, once his fleet was in the strait and problems emerged, he didn't order a retreat. Pulling 600 ships out of a confined space in the middle of a battle would have been chaotic and costly, but less costly than continuing to feed ships into a meat grinder. Xerxes seems to have believed that sheer numbers would eventually prevail. They didn't. Those two mistakes destroyed Persian naval power and ended the invasion. On the Greek side, the internal political dynamics almost prevented the battle from happening. If Themistocles hadn't deceived Xerxes into forcing the engagement, the allied Greek fleet probably would have retreated to Corinth. The alliance would have fractured. Athens would have been abandoned. The Persians would have won strategically without fighting. Themistocles' willingness to manipulate his own allies, to force them into a battle they didn't want, demonstrates a level of ruthless pragmatism that's almost disturbing. He gambled the survival of Athens and possibly all of Greece on his strategic assessment. He was right, but if he'd been wrong, history would remember him as the man who destroyed Greece. That's the burden of command. Make the right call, you're a genius. Make the wrong call, you're a catastrophe. The tactical execution by Greek trireme crews deserves recognition. Rowing a trireme requires about 170 rowers working in perfect coordination. Each rower has one oar. The 3 levels of oars on each side must stroke in synchronized rhythm, otherwise the ship loses speed and maneuverability. In battle, while under arrow fire, with ships colliding around you, with the knowledge that if your ship sinks you'll drown, maintaining that coordination is nearly impossible. Greek crews did it, for hours, under maximum stress. That level of training and discipline doesn't happen by accident. Athens had been building and training its navy for years before Salamis. That investment paid off when precision mattered most. Compare the Greek and Persian approaches to naval warfare. The Persians relied on numerical superiority and individual ship quality. Many of their ships came from Phoenicia and Egypt, regions with strong maritime traditions. They expected that larger numbers plus good ships would guarantee victory. The Greeks focused on tactics, training, and using terrain to negate numerical disadvantages. Their ships weren't necessarily better, though Greek triremes were generally well built, but their strategic thinking was superior. They fought smart instead of fighting big. In military history, that's often the difference between victory and annihilation. After Salamis, Themistocles became one of the most powerful men in Athens. His strategic vision had saved the city and possibly all of Greece. But here's the irony. Within a few years, Athenian politics turned against him. His rivals accused him of arrogance and ambition. He was ostracized, a democratic procedure where citizens voted to exile someone for 10 years. Themistocles fled Athens, wandered through Greece, and eventually ended up in Persia. The man who had destroyed the Persian fleet was granted refuge and a pension by the Persian king. He spent his final years living in Persian territory, governing a small city that Persia had given him. History has few ironies sharper than that. The savior of Greece ended his life in the empire he defeated because his own people couldn't tolerate his presence. That's politics. Victory doesn't guarantee gratitude. The strategic lessons from Salamis remain relevant. First, numerical superiority means nothing if you can't deploy it effectively. The Persians had twice as many ships and lost because they fought in terrain where those numbers became a liability. Second, deception works when it confirms enemy assumptions. Themistocles didn't invent a complicated ruse. He told Xerxes what Xerxes wanted to hear. Third, choosing the battlefield is half the battle. Themistocles forced the fight to happen where geography favored Greece. The Persians could have refused. They didn't. Fourth, morale and training matter more than equipment. Greek crews weren't rowing better ships. They were rowing their ships better. Those lessons appear repeatedly throughout military history because they're fundamental. Salamis just demonstrated them with unusual clarity. One final element worth considering: the role of intelligence and information. Themistocles' deception worked because the Persians had poor intelligence about Greek decision-making. They didn't understand that the Greek fleet was divided and indecisive. They assumed Greek resolve was stronger than it was, which made Themistocles' claim that the fleet planned to escape seem credible. Meanwhile, the Greeks had better information about Persian capabilities and intentions. They knew the size of the Persian fleet. They knew its composition. They knew enough to predict how it would behave in confined waters. Information asymmetry favored Greece. That's not accidental. Themistocles invested in intelligence gathering because he understood its value. Xerxes relied on assumptions. That asymmetry killed 600 ships. So what do we take away from Salamis? The Battle of Salamis proves that strategy beats strength, that geography is a weapon if you know how to use it, that deception works when you understand your enemy's psychology, that training and discipline overcome numerical disadvantages, that one brilliant commander, willing to take enormous risks and manipulate everyone around him, can change the course of history. Themistocles wasn't a saint. He was a ruthless political operator who manipulated friends and enemies alike to achieve his objectives. But he saved Greece. He destroyed the Persian fleet. He made Western civilization possible. Those are the facts. Whether you admire him or find him morally questionable is irrelevant. He won, the Persians lost. And 2,500 years later, we are speaking languages descended from Greek culture, thinking thoughts influenced by Greek philosophy, living in political systems inspired by Greek democracy. Salamis made that possible. If this story taught you something about strategy, about history, about how one battle can ripple through centuries, here's what I need. Hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what you think about Themistocles' deception or the tactical execution at Salamis. Subscribe to this channel because we're telling the stories that textbooks skip, the battles that shouldn't have been won, the strategies that defied logic, the moments when everything changed because one person saw what nobody else did. No fluff, no oversimplification, just history the way it actually happened. Thanks for watching. Now you know how 300 Greek ships destroyed the Persian Empire's navy, and you know it wasn't a miracle. It was geography, deception, and the willingness to trap your own allies into fighting a battle they didn't want. That's not heroic. That's just how wars are won.